You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back, hockey fans. We got a very special edition for you guys here today, a trade deadline special that is going to feature several of our Locked On hosts whose teams were buyers at the trade deadline on Monday. This is Jon Chik with Locked On New York Rangers. I'm joined by Hunter Hodies of Locked On Penguins, Ian McLaren of Locked On Bruins, and Armando Velez of Locked On Panthers. And guys, I figure we might as well just go ahead and jump right into it here. First question for all of you, and we can start with Hunter. After all the moves that were made among the Eastern Conference teams that certainly look like they're going to be in the playoffs, who would you consider to be the favorite coming out of both the Atlantic and Metro division, and who do you think will ultimately make it to the Stanley Cup Finals? Hunter, you're up first.
Well, that's certainly a good question. I think from the Atlantic, it's probably one of Florida or Tampa Bay. I think at least for me, Florida is going to need to get Ekblad back, though, if they're going to have any shot of going on a run here. We all saw what happened last year when they looked like they were humming, and then he got hurt and was out for the rest of the playoffs, and then Tampa beat them in 6 games. So if he can be back for the playoffs, I think that would be my team to beat in the East. Well, from the Atlantic at least, metropolitan-wise, I have Pittsburgh and Carolina at the top. I would probably side with Carolina a little more right now. I think the Penguins struggled against them in the 3 meetings this year. That's honestly the team that's really carried the play against them, even though I think that would be one heck of a 7-game series. That said, out of the East at least, I still think Florida makes a very deep run and goes to the final. I do think they will get Ekblad back for the playoffs, though, again, if they don't, I probably would take Carolina to come out of the East. I know Tampa Bay really went all in yet again. They got Hagel, a couple other players, but they've also played a lot of hockey these last few years, which is why it's so hard to go on a three-peat. So I do think if Florida gets that Ekblad back, they come out, but if they don't, I am going to side with Carolina. Still not sure on who wins the cup. I think at this point, I kind of side a little bit with the Avalanche just because I think this is the year that they can prove that they can win in the playoffs. But until they do that, who knows? I think at this point.
All right. Definitely some interesting thoughts there. Ian, you're up, man. What do you think? Who you got?
I mean, from the Atlantic, I've been thinking about this a lot, and for me, it always comes down to who has the better goalie in the playoffs, and I think the Tampa Bay Lightning still, with Andrei Vasilevsky back there, probably the best goalie in the world. They still have Victor Hedman, still have Nikita Kucherov, Steven Stamkos playing at a high level. They added, like Hunter mentioned, Brandon Hagel, Nick Paul. For me, they're still the team to beat in the Atlantic Division. I do worry about Florida a little bit with Ekblad's uncertainty and with Sergei Bobrovsky's sub 900 save percentage for his career in the playoffs. And the Maple Leafs, kind of like what Hunter said about the Avalanche, until they do it, kind of won't believe it until I see it, that they're able to get it done in the playoffs. As far as the Bruins go, they added Hampus Lindholm. I would have liked to have seen them add more up front to really make a run. Although having said that, heading into Thursday's game against the Lightning, they're only 1 point back of Tampa Bay and could jump over them. But I still think at the end of the day, it's Tampa's division to lose, and the idea of kind of winning a three-peat, just too tantalizing for them not to just give it their all and do it one more time. Out of the the Metro, that's a pretty tough call, but I think you got to go with Carolina. They've been the best team in that division all season long. I still have some questions about Frederik Andersen as a Bruins observer. I've seen him kind of fall apart in the playoffs in the past. But they have as deep a team up front and on the back end as anybody in the NHL, and I really do think they'll be able to take it to the next level this year. And then, for the Cup, I could see Carolina and Colorado in the final. Tampa, Colorado, I think, is what is going to happen. I think the Avs are just too good out in the West, and I do think it's Colorado's year, especially after some of the moves that they made prior to the trade deadline.
And we'll go ahead and get our thoughts from Armando Velez of Locked On Panthers as well. Armando, you're up, man. Who you got? Who's winning these two divisions?
Ian made some great points in regard to goaltending. Andrei Vasilevsky is the best goaltender in the world. And that's the reason why the Florida Panthers went after someone like Claude Giroux, because they wanted to shore up that scoring. And I talk about all the time about how in hockey, it's very similar to baseball, that the best way to win in baseball is your pitching. The most valuable way to win in hockey is your goaltending. And that's where Ian is absolutely correct when it comes to that. But I also think that with how the Florida Panthers scored, I mean, games slow down in the playoffs. That's a reality. But I'm very confident that the Florida Panthers really can find a way to really score deep into games whenever they can. The third period is their highest goal differential in any period this season. So out of the teams that go out in the Atlantic, the Battle of Florida is likely to happen again in the second round. We can see this go 7, but even though Tampa Bay lost a third line, they recouped it. They got another third line just like that. I do think that the Florida Panthers do eventually break through and get to the Eastern Conference Final. The Metro is a little confusing for me because you have Igor Shesterkin, who's carrying that New York Rangers team. They got a little bit of a forward help in their middle six / bottom six, including Frank Vatrano from the Florida Panthers as one of them. And the power play, if the New York Rangers aren't getting power plays, are they going to be able to make their way to the Eastern Conference Final? And that's the really thing I question as far as the Metro. Freddie Anderson as well. Ian also talked about Freddie Anderson. So what's he going to look like there? And of course, Pittsburgh, you can never count out Sidney Crosby and Geno Malkin there. They traded for Raquel from the Anaheim Ducks to get some help there as well. And I know Chris Letang is going to be a free agent this offseason, but I just saw that he had a power play goal last night. So he's still definitely got it. You can never count out the Pittsburgh Penguins. But I think when push comes to shove, I think the Pittsburgh Penguins are actually going to come out of the Metro over Carolina because of the experience. You can never count out Sidney Crosby. As far as the Cup, I still think it's the Colorado Avalanche. I mean, even with 2 games in hand that the Florida Panthers have on Colorado, even if they were to win those 2, they would still be behind in points behind the Avalanche for the Avs to get the President's Trophy. But of course, no team has won the Stanley Cup winning the President's Trophy since 2013. So, but I think that the Colorado Avalanche, they added to their bottom 6 as well, even though their trade for Claude Giroux didn't go through. Their offer was bigger to Philadelphia than Florida had, but they used some of those I would assume assets that they would have traded for Giroux to fill up their bottom 6. So I still think that that Colorado is this is their year to win it.
Yeah, and I don't weigh in as far as these division winners are concerned. For the Metro Carolina Hurricanes, obviously I'm a Ranger fan, but it's a very unique situation in the Eastern Conference because unlike a lot of years, we've pretty much known for quite some time. I mean, there's no guarantees, but it certainly looks like, the 8 playoff teams that were looking like they were going to remain in those positions are indeed going to remain in those positions. So it's unique in and of that reason itself. But, for the Metro, I'm going to go with the Hurricanes just because I think this team is absolutely loaded from top to bottom. It's a team that's kind of been knocking on the door the past couple of seasons. And on top of, all the great players that they returned this year, they've now got Freddie Anderson standing on his head and having a Vezina-worthy season out. They're obviously not the highest scoring team that's going to be in the playoffs. I believe they're about 11th or so in goals per game, but we know how the playoffs can be. You know, there's a lot of grinded out, you know, blue collar type games. And I think that suits the Canes style just perfectly. They lead the NHL in goals allowed. They have the best, they lead that stat, you know, in the entire NHL. And again, you know, Freddie Anderson is just killing it for them. But very, very conflicted if the Canes, you know, go on to win the Stanley Cup, because right now it feels like they have about 25 different former New York Rangers on the team. So that'd be a very bittersweet moment for me. But again, I think the Canes, you know, they're looking really good. And as a Ranger fan, I've been emphasizing the importance of staying out of fourth place, because I want no part of that team in the first round. You know, we know the 4 teams that are going to make it, but I'd much rather the Rangers play the Penguins or the Capitals in the first round rather than the Carolina Hurricanes. And as far as the Atlantic, I'm going to go with the Panthers. You know, Ian, I think you made some great points about the Tampa Bay Lightning, and certainly, you know, they're a threat to get a three-peat. But I just think that, you know, that'd kind of be like the standard answer. So I kind of want to go against the grain a little bit. And I love the moves that the Panthers made it at the trade deadline this season. You know, bring in Ben Sherratt, bring in, you know, Claude Giroux as well. It's just kind of a case of the rich getting richer. And, you know, they just got a great team. And it's a team that's kind of been knocking on the door the last couple of seasons as well. So I'll say for the Eastern Conference Finals, give me Hurricanes and Panthers. And sorry, Armando, but I think the Hurricanes are going to pull it out there and end up in the Stanley Cup Finals. But we'll continue rolling. We're just getting started here, scratching the surface. But first, just want to let everybody know today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by BetOnline.net. It's that time of year again, as college basketball's tournament is finally upon us. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, BetOnline.net is the #1 source for all your sports betting needs and info. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline, where the game starts. And we just want to thank everybody for making all these great Locked On shows your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. And I should also mention that there were a couple of Locked On hosts that were not able to join us today for this impromptu post-trade deadline edition here, but they were nice enough to send in a couple of videos. And we're going to go ahead and get some thoughts from the guys from Locked On Avalanche, on how the Avs fared at the trade deadline. Just get their general thoughts, and we're going to hear from them right now.
How's it going, everybody? Chris and Kyle from Locked On Avalanche. And while we couldn't be part of the trade deadline roundtable, we still wanted to put in our 2 cents on how the Avalanche did at the trade deadline. And I think I speak for both of us when we say that Joe Sakic pretty much hit a home run with the trade acquisitions for the Avalanche. Nothing that's like, I would say, a massive splash, but there were needs that the Avalanche needed to address. And I think that the Colorado Avalanche and Joe Sakic did that hand over fist.
Especially when you look at the names that Sakic went and acquired in the trade deadline and what he gave up for these pieces. It doesn't make a lot of sense until you look at how it's applied to the lineup. Like, the Avalanche aren't really a team that need to go out there and get that household name to solidify the team as a whole. With names like Cale Makar and Nathan MacKinnon already on this roster, you just need an additional piece to get you through the playoffs, because as the defending President's Trophy champion, like, you know how to win the regular season. You just need to win the cup, and that's what these pieces are going to help you do.
Yeah, great point. And for you get Josh Manson, who helps you on the defensive end. You get Nico Sturm, who will help you for some depth forward, and you get rid of Tyson Jost in the process. Then you go get Andrew Cogliano. And the big move that they made was for Artturi Lehkonen. That, if you're going to pull one big name out of this, that's the one that kind of turned some heads. That really, the Avalanche are just going to add him to the mix? Okay, fine. It just makes him that much more difficult to face. And what did they give up in the end? Like I said, you gave up Tyson Jost. Sure, you give up Drew Hellison, who's one of your top prospects, but maybe your top prospect in Justin Barron for Lehkonen. But that's what you have to do when you're the Avalanche at this stage in the game and at this stage in the season. Like Kyle said, you're preparing for the postseason. And then on top of that, those are the only 2 players that they gave up, and then draft picks, none of which was a first-round pick. When first-round picks were flying across the league, Joe Sakic said we are not going to get rid of a first-round pick, and he didn't. So the question you have to ask yourself, after all these moves, the Avalanche were in a good spot before all these moves. Are they better because of this moves, I think you have to unequivocally say they are, and that's a scary thing.
Not only is Sakic building for this year and winning the cup this year, knowing that contracts are up in the next coming years for some star players on the team, we still hold those first round draft picks. So he's building for the cup this year and still maintaining for years to come. That's why Sakic is the best GM in the league.
And he probably still won't get nominated for best GM of the league. One of the greatest mysteries in the league for the past couple seasons. But all that will matter is if the Avalanche can win the Stanley Cup, because the moves that they made last year, people liked them at the deadline. They didn't pan out. These you feel a little bit more comfortable that they will, but you still have to wait and see. And the Avalanche are in a much better spot after the deadline than they were before it. Now they just have to go out and perform in the postseason, which has eluded them for the past couple seasons.
All right, so huge thanks to Chris and Kyle for sending in that video there, sharing their thoughts. Obviously, Avalanche, they're kind of in Stanley Cup or bust territory at this point, especially when you consider the regular season that they're having and how far they are above pretty much everybody in the Western Conference. But we'll just keep this thing rolling here. And question for everybody that's on the call here, so to speak. Who do you guys think was the biggest loser among the Eastern Conference playoff teams on deadline day here? And once again, we'll stick with the same order and we'll toss it to Hunter.
See, that's a good question. I think obviously, Tampa Bay had made some really good moves. They don't really care about their draft picks, nor should they. They're going for 3 in a row. Obviously, I thought Pittsburgh made a really good move by getting Rickard Rakell. I thought Boston did some very smart additions, especially with Hampus Lindholm. I'm not really crazy about the long-term extension for him, but that's a team that I don't think a lot of people are talking about. I don't think it would surprise anyone if they can go on a deep run here. Carolina made a good move by getting Max Domi. I wasn't super crazy about what the Washington Capitals did, and maybe it's because they don't feel like this is their year. I mean, Marcus Johansson is not what he used to be. Johan Larsson is good defensively, doesn't bring a lot of offense. I feel like they should have went out and gotten another defenseman. Michael Kempny is not really that good anymore. John Carlson has kind of been fading for the last year or two. I mean, Dmitry Olov's fine, but they just don't have, a lot of good shutdown defensemen on their back end. Justin Schultz is not nearly what he used to be. Trust me. I'm pretty sure I saw him really fall off during his last year here in Pittsburgh. So I think if there's a loser, maybe it's Washington, just because, they didn't go all in like some of the other teams did. I mean, that's not to say that I don't think the Capitals, aren't a good team. They definitely are, and they are going to be a tough out in the playoffs. But I definitely think they should have added a defenseman at the deadline, and maybe if they wanted to go out and get a goalie, they could have done that as well. I liked what Florida did with Giroux. Outside of that, I'm not really too crazy about some of their other moves. But getting Ben Sherratt for that really high price is definitely weird. And especially, Robert Hagg, I think you're just going all in on toughness when, it just kind of reminds me of what the Penguins did back in 2013 when they had this almost like this super team, but then they go out and get Douglas Murray and Brendan Morrow, and those two players didn't really help out at all. But again, I would probably say Washington definitely didn't do as much as they should have, in my opinion.
Yeah, all right. So I think that's a great choice. The Caps, there's a lot of teams around them that obviously got a little bit better, and they a couple small moves, but nothing too crazy. But Ian, you're up, man. Who was the biggest loser in the Eastern Conference as far as the playoff teams are concerned?
Well, I think I do want to be slightly critical of my own team, just for the sake of fairness. I do really think the Bruins missed when they didn't trade for either a true second line center or a scoring right-hand shot. That's a huge hole that was left when David Krejci decided to move back home. And although Eric Hall has been playing pretty well in that position, I don't see him as a number 2 guy on a cup winning team or cup contending team. I know people will say he played that role for Vegas when they went to the final, but that was a few years ago now, and that was just a weird thing all around. I would have liked to have seen them trade Jake DeBrusk as well. That whole thing's been hanging over them. He kind of has one foot out the door. Extremely streaky player. Hopefully he goes on a hot streak down the stretch and when these games matter most. But I would have liked them to kind of get rid of that potential distraction, and bring in a scoring winger like a Raquel, like the Penguins were able to land. But I'm gonna say the Toronto Maple Leafs, for not adding a goalie. They are allowing more goals per game in 2022 than teams like the Arizona Coyotes, the Buffalo Sabres, Seattle Kraken. They're down in the bottom 10 in that category, and just very head scratching that they did not add at that position. I know there were some back and forth with Chicago, and some barbs sent between the two Kyle GMs there about those reports coming out with respect to Marc-Andre Fleury, whether or not he wanted to go there. That perhaps was a deciding factor there, but the market perhaps a bit limited when it comes to goaltending. They tried to add at that position through the waiver wire, and they were blocked in that respect, which is kind of hilarious because that always happens to the Leafs. But to not add a goalie to go into the playoffs, relying on Jack Campbell, who was good to start, fallen off. Peter Mrazek has been pretty terrible lately. I just think that team is doomed for another first round exit as a result of not addressing that position.
All right, and Armando, you're up next. Once again, biggest loser among Eastern Conference playoff teams at the deadline here.
Yeah, Ian stole a lot of what I wanted to say about the Toronto Maple Leafs. Artturi is the name that the Toronto Maple Leafs went after for goaltender, and according to Elliot Friedman of Sportsnet, 5 teams went into trying to claim Artturi from the Toronto Maple Leafs. So, and the Toronto Maple Leafs over the last few seasons have had 5 more players claimed off of waivers than any other team. So nobody wants to help Toronto, and just like as Andrew and Mary on the Crosscheck NHL show, nobody wants to help them out. So these GMs, they're competitive, and some of them don't necessarily like each other. If leaks start coming out, I know there's going to be. I'm not sure if we're going to see any trades via Chicago or Toronto in the near future, but there's also a question about whether it was an agent, maybe Alan Walsh, who's also Jonathan Huberdeau's agent as well, and he's trying to get him paid. So Toronto's a big loser of mine. But there's also a Western Conference team that I'm maybe thinking that they're kind of a loser in the trade deadline, and I'm going to go kind of with the Dallas Stars. What are they going to do with John Klingberg as far as him being a UFA? There is a contract talk stalled as well. Are they going to be able to re-sign him? They have long-term contracts with Jamie Benn and Tyler Seguin there. They have to pay Jason Robertson as well, Jake Ottinger out there as well. So the Dallas Stars on the Western Conference side of things are my biggest loser, and as well as the obvious one, the Vegas Golden Knights, as well, with the whole Evgeny Dadonov situation. But Eastern Conference, it's Toronto. Western Conference, it's Dallas and Vegas for me.
Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and agree with Hunter. I think the biggest losers among the Eastern Conference team, definitely the Washington Capitals. Now, they did make a couple of small moves. Vitek Vanacek, Marcus Johansson both brought in. But the way I see it, the Capitals, they're not getting any younger. This is a veteran team. And, of course, they had the one Stanley Cup championship a few years ago. But, for that core group of players, I got to figure, they're probably running out of chances to add a second Stanley Cup. And I don't know, coming into the deadline this season, I thought they might kind of push all their chips to the center of the table, really go all in, really make a big-time splashy move or two, and try to run down some of these teams that are ahead of them in the Metro Division. And that's another thing, because when you look at the Metro, the Rangers made a lot of moves. The Canes, they brought in Max Domi. They didn't do a whole lot, but Domi's a good player and somebody that could definitely help them. And the Penguins made a couple of moves as well. The biggest thing they did, of course, is bring in Rickard Rakell. So, the Capitals, they go into the deadline 4th place in the Metro. Certainly they're going to make the playoffs, but they're staring up at 3 teams. And the divide between the Capitals and those 3 teams, at least on the surface, got a little bit bigger. And again, all the teams we cover, everybody that's on this call, everybody made at least 1 or 2, fairly significant moves to make themselves better going into the playoffs. The Capitals didn't, and I don't know. I mean, that's going to be tough for them to overcome, I think, come playoff time, because even as things stand, I think they might be destined for yet another first-round exit. We'll see how it shakes out. But yeah, for me, it's the Capitals that are the biggest losers of this whole deadline here, not just in the Eastern Conference, but probably in the entire NHL. And as I mentioned earlier, there were a couple of Locked On hosts that were not able to join this call here today. But again, they were nice enough to send in some pre-recorded videos. And what we're going to do now is play a video from Seth Toupal from Locked On Minnesota Wild. He sent in a video just kind of sharing his general thoughts on everything that the Wild did. So let's go ahead and hear from Seth right now.
Everybody, Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, answering the question where the Wild stands now in the Western Conference. So Marc-Andre Fleury, Nick Delorier, and Jacob Middleton in after some trade deadline moves by the Wild. And I think this makes the Wild at least the third best team in the Western Conference. Wild have addressed the goalie position. They've got a goalie who can potentially steal some games for them. The combo of Talbot and Kakkonen, inconsistent this year, and I think the best that you're going to get out of them is a game in which they keep you in it, but don't necessarily steal one that maybe the offense doesn't perform well. Fleury can do that for this Wild team. So I think over the course of a series, I think he can take at least one game that you probably should have lost. Look at what he did last year against the Wild in Vegas. I think that ability still exists with him. And so I think that is a huge get for the Minnesota Wild. Also addressing the physicality that has seen them get pushed around by the likes of Florida and Calgary here over the second half of the season. I think the Wild have addressed that enough to where I think they can hold their own against some of these teams. And so, Colorado's still the class of the Western Conference, but I think the Wild have gotten themselves into the discussion to where they can contend with the Calgary. And so, maybe not quite on the Avalanche level, but a team that can compete with them, and I think is in that next step below with the likes of Calgary as some of the best teams in the Western Conference. So the big question becomes then, can the Wild steal enough games to upset in a playoff series? Well, that remains to be seen. We'll have to wait until playoff time to see if they can answer that question. For more on the Minnesota Wild, make sure you follow Locked On Wild wherever you listen to podcasts.
All right, so huge thanks to Seth for sending in that video, sharing his thoughts on everything that the Wild did, heading into the trade deadline here in the home stretch. I figure we might as well go with a Wild-related question next, and that's going to be, where do the Wild slot in the Western Conference, pecking order after adding Marc-Andre Fleury, and are they in the same level as, say, Colorado and Calgary, or are they somewhere below them? And once again, we will go ahead and start with Hunter. Your thoughts on the Wild adding Fleury and where they stand right now?
Yeah, I definitely think Minnesota's, in the tier below, I think Calgary and Colorado. I think some people do sleep on the Flames this year. I know the Avalanche are obviously the big talking point for the West, but Calgary is right up there as well. I think they're going to bully someone in the first round. But Minnesota, I think they can play with those two teams. Remember, last year they played with Vegas pretty well in that series, and I know they ended up losing to them. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was like 5 or 6. I don't think it was a 5 or 6. I think it was actually a 7-game series. But they showed that point that they can play with some of the top teams in the West. And, getting Marc-Andre Fleury, that's a big acquisition for them. I personally didn't think he was going to move, but, then I did realize Billy Guerin is the GM in Minnesota. Him and Fleury have had a lot of history. They won a Stanley Cup together in 2009 when Billy G was still playing with the Penguins. Then obviously he was assistant general manager with Pittsburgh when Fleury was there. So they're definitely pretty tight. And I think that's the main reason that he did end up going to Minnesota. But, Kaprizov is a one-man wrecking crew. He can, come alive in an instant. Matt Zuccarello is having one heck of a year. This is a team that can definitely, I think win a round or two. I think maybe win a round. I think at least one round right now. I'm not really sure if they're going to win two. But for me, they're definitely in that tier below Colorado and Calgary. I would probably rank them as the third best team in the conference right now, just looking at the Pacific Division and the rest of the Central. I know St. Louis has had a really good year, but if those two teams were to play in the playoffs, I would probably give the small edge to Minnesota, at least in my opinion.
All right, and Ian, your thoughts on the Wild picking up Marc-Andre Fleury and where they currently stand in the Western Conference pecking order?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have been a crime against hockey if Marc-Andre Fleury was not in the playoffs this season. I was not a fan of him kind of toiling away with the Chicago Blackhawks. Minnesota, a very fun team to watch. And I do agree with Hunter. I think they could certainly take the St. Louis Blues if they were to match up in the first round. However, I still do think that Colorado, even Calgary, those two teams are the class of the Western Conference, and it would take, a pretty vintage or all-world performance from Marc-Andre Fleury in order to take down one of those two teams, especially the Avalanche. That's who Minnesota would most likely have to get through in order to advance to the Western Conference Finals. And again, like we've been saying, I think Colorado is just too good and too strong to be thwarted by Marc-Andre Fleury. Yeah, he's the reigning Vezina Trophy candidate, but he's still winner. But he's not, the Marc-Andre Fleury of old necessarily. And the Avalanche attack is just too strong, I think, to not make it through the Minnesota Wild. So I'd still slot them behind Colorado and Calgary, but probably, in that middle tier of Western Conference teams for sure.
All right, and Armando, your thoughts once again on Marc-Andre Fleury to the Wild and how this impacts the Wild and their chances going forward here.
I think they're now the third best team in the West, right behind Colorado and Calgary. If they happened to be in the Pacific Division and facing off Calgary, they'd have a chance to they'd have a real chance to advance to the Western Conference Final, but that's not the case. So they have to go through Colorado, and Colorado, my pick to represent the West in the Stanley Cup Final. So it's gonna take Marc-Andre Fleury being Marc-Andre Fleury of old, of course, and well, he just won a Vezina last year, but still, he's got to have that Vezina Trophy caliber play all throughout the playoffs. I know the pick that's sent to the Blackhawks, it's 4 out of the 8 wins have to belong to Marc-Andre Fleury and advance to the Western Conference Final. But I just think that Colorado is too good. They have a embarrassment of riches. I know I'm talking about from a Panthers perspective, embarrassment of riches from the Eastern Conference. The West for Colorado, they have their embarrassment of riches out there in Colorado. There's still the question of Darcy Kemper in goal for the Colorado Avalanche about injury history, especially. But with the firepower that the Colorado Avalanche have, I think that they're gonna advance past the Minnesota Wild and represent the Central Division in the Western Conference Final against the Calgary Flames.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys pretty much hit the nail on the head, and I think Seth hit the nail on the head as well when he mentioned that he thinks that the Wild, with the acquisition of Fleury, are now, one of the top 3 teams in the Western Conference. I'd slot them just probably below Colorado and Calgary. But with Fleury, and Hunter, you and me can definitely appreciate this because we've seen the Rangers and the Penguins have some just epic playoff series over the years. It feels like it's always going 7 games and there's overtime games and just general madness. But, watching Fleury so often in the playoffs, there's a very wide range of outcomes when it comes to him. He can be the best goalie in the postseason and just stand on his head and just simply not let the puck get by him. By that same token, we've seen him in the playoffs certain years look like he's never played hockey before. So it's really hard to put your finger on this and really know exactly what you're going to get with him moving to a new situation in Minnesota. But I will say this. It seems like every time people kind of leave Fleury for dead, he proves them wrong. People were thinking that he was on the downswing even when he went from Pittsburgh to Vegas. And the next thing you know, he's in the Stanley Cup Finals as the starting goalie for an expansion team, which is crazy in and of itself. But I think, his stats aren't the best this season, but obviously he was on a pretty hopeless situation in Chicago. I think getting onto a better team will kind of reinvigorate him. And, like I was talking about with the Capitals, we don't know how many more chances they're going to get this. This is kind of the same thing, but it's with an individual player. We don't know how many more chances Marc-Andre Fleury is going to get to go on a Stanley Cup run. I believe he's like 36 or so now, so starting to get up there a little bit. But I think he's going to play well for this Minnesota Wild team, and I think they're absolutely a threat. I think for sure they'll at least get out of the first round. I would take them in a series against the Blues, which I believe is who they'd be lined up to play if the season ended right now. And if they played the Avalanche in the second round, I think that series would be a doozy. I think it's going 7 games, and buckle up for a series like that. And it'd be fun for us to watch, guys, because, when you watch your own team in the playoffs, you're on pins and needles and you're yelling at the TV and all that stuff. But when you're watching, 2 other teams that you're kind of indifferent toward, you can just kick back and watch some good hockey. But, Fleury, he definitely tips the scales a little bit in the Western Conference, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what he can do for the Wild come playoff time. To me, the Wild, they're right there. They're right there with the Flames and the Avalanche, and I think they've got a chance to end up representing the West. But that kind of leads me into the next question that I wanted to ask everybody, and that is, do any of these teams in the Western Conference stand a chance against the Avalanche? As we talked about, the Avs, they're head and shoulders above everybody as far as current record. But does anybody think that, any certain teams are a threat to them, or is there a team that might even be considered the favorite over the Avalanche? And once again, Hunter, you've got the floor.
I think Calgary can really give them a series. Johnny Gaudreau is having one hell of a season. I know he's an unrestricted free agent after this year, but he's really showing that he's going to get his money. That's for sure. But honestly, Calgary is really deep. Lindholm on the top line as well. They got Tyler Toffoli from Montreal over a month ago. Matthew Tkachuk is on the second line. Mikael Backlund, Blake Coleman, Kalle Yarncrux. Sean Monahan's on the fourth line, and he's a pretty decent player. Defensively, I'm not too crazy about them, even though Hanifin is pretty decent. Chris Tanev's having, a nice little renaissance these last couple of years. But goaltending-wise, they have a goalie that can stand on his head whenever, and he was doing that a lot this season. That's Jacob Markstrom. He's been one of the best goalies in the league. And Daryl Sutter has done one heck of a job with this team. I know usually Daryl Sutter teams are not the most fun to watch. I've kind of compared it at times to, Barry Trotz with the Islanders when they kind of just bore the game down. But, there's a lot of stars on this Calgary team that, they are a fun team to watch. And, any team that gets them, I think in the first round is going to have a rough time. And I do want to see, Calgary and Colorado go at it in a conference final because it would make for some very entertaining hockey. 2 very well coached teams. I think, if Daryl Sutter is not a top Jack Adams trophy contender, then I don't know what the heck we're doing here. But I definitely think if there's one team that can really match up against Colorado and potentially beat them, it's the Calgary Flames.
All right. And Ian, your thoughts on any team in the Western Conference, or maybe even 1 or 2 teams that can potentially stand up to the Colorado Avalanche?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Hunter. I think the Flames have the best chance of matching up with the Avs. Markstrom, probably a Vezina Trophy finalist. They're allowing, I believe, the second fewest goals allowed this season. Only Carolina is allowing fewer goals per game than the Calgary Flames. I still think, though, that even though they're a bit of a mess right now and they're not even guaranteed to make the playoffs, I think Vegas could still make some noise in the postseason, but there's so many ifs that go along with that. They need to get healthy Robin Lehner. They need to figure out their salary cap situation with Evgeny Dadonov being not traded. But if they can figure that out, and if they get Mark Stone back healthy, Max Pacioretty firing on all cylinders, Jack Eichel is in the mix. A lot of things have to come together for that team, but they always seem to do for Vegas. And I still think they could make some noise there in the Pacific Division. But ultimately, I really do think that it's Calgary or Colorado that comes out of the Western Conference. Having said that, we all know that it's rarely the top teams in each division that make it to the Final Four. There's always some surprises along the way. And not that Vegas would be a surprise based on who they have, but a lot of things would have to come together for them to come out of the West. And I think it's possible that it does work out for them.
Yeah, a lot of people kind of counting out Vegas, but Ian, to your point, I think, if they do get in, they could be a threat for all those reasons that you just mentioned. We'll go ahead and toss it to Armando here. Armando, who's the biggest threat to the Avalanche over there in the Western Conference?
Before I do, that's a lot of ifs, Ian. And Vegas has 16 games to figure out all of those ifs. So when it comes to all that, I go back to Calgary when it comes to former Florida Panthers goalie prospect Jacob Markstrom, who it took a little bit of time for him to develop. Spent a little bit of time in Vancouver, being traded for Roberto Luongo back in like 2014. So it took Jacob Markstrom a little bit of time to get accumulated to the NHL, and now great to see that Vancouver, even though he walked, that they are in pretty good position with Thatcher Demko in goal, but still goaltending is what it comes down to. And even though if I had to choose a second team outside of the Flames or the Wild, maybe the LA Kings. You never know what kind of play you'll get from Jonathan Quick. They don't score a lot of goals. The LA Kings are not a goal-scoring team, but you never know that their goaltending could possibly win a playoff series and make a little bit of noise in the Pacific Division. I'm not sold on Edmonton, their goalie situation. That's another situation where we could talk about how they kind of lost in the trade deadline as far as building around McDavid and Draisaitl. But maybe it's a big maybe with the LA Kings. But Calgary, they got the goaltending to match up against Colorado.
Yeah, for sure. And Armando, I'm glad you mentioned the Kings there. They're one of those teams that I don't know that they're getting the respect that they deserve. I don't know how seriously they're being taken by a lot of hockey analysts and just fans in general. But they've got an interesting mix of, talented young players, but then also, some veterans who have turned back the clock and a couple guys left from, the most recent championship teams. So I think they're going to be interesting come playoff time. They could be a little bit of a dark horse. But let me just say, as far as, teams standing a chance against the Avs, everybody stands a chance. And that's what's great about the Stanley Cup playoffs because, I know a lot of people love March Madness, and me too. I'll check out the tournament and everything. But we all know when that tournament starts, a 16 seed is not going to win the national title. And when it comes to the Stanley Cup playoffs, I don't think you can really point to any team and just say, oh, they have no chance or that team has no chance. I don't know how many of us would have said that the Montreal Canadiens, for example, were going to make it to the Stanley Cup finals last season. And I think something else that you guys all touched on is the goaltending situation. And you look at the Flames. To begin with, they just have a great team. But on top of that, Jacob Markstrom probably having the best season of his career, somebody that should definitely be in the mix for a Vezina. And I'm still a very firm believer. I don't know if this is cliche or whatever, but a hot goalie and a good goalie can take you a long, long way in these Stanley Cup playoffs. And I think the Flames really have an edge there. And Markstrom, if he continues to do in the playoffs what he's done the entire season, then the Flames are a serious threat. And honestly, I think I might actually take them. If it's them and the Avalanche, the last two teams left, I think I might take the Flames to win that series. Now, maybe part of the reason for that is that the Flames played the Rangers twice this season, and they beat them by a combined score of like 11-1. So I saw the Flames at their absolute best, so maybe I'm drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit. But to me, that's a very dangerous team. And the fact that they have Jacob Markstrom, a goalie that, again, is going to be in the Vezina mix, that makes them just even better. So, yeah, listen, guys, this was a ton of fun doing this little roundtable discussion here, breaking down all the moves that happened, all the moves that didn't happen. And, we'll definitely have to look to do this again at some point. Maybe we'll get some kind of an off-season episode or something like that. But, listen, hockey fans, everybody that tuned in to watch this here today, we really appreciate it. And we will see you guys next time.